I'm super excited for today's guest. It's Patrick Krill, a lawyer, an addiction counselor, founder of Krill Strategies, which is a consulting firm dedicated to improving mental health and well-being in the legal profession. I remember reading a book not that long ago that talked about lawyers as having some of the most difficult time with feeling happy and fulfilled. And Patrick really addresses the heart of that issue. He's widely recognized as a leading authority on behavioral health and law. He led groundbreaking research about 10 years ago and is about to update that research in conjunction with the ABA. He's authored over 70 articles on addiction and mental health, is a trusted advisor to many of the nation's top law firms, and a driving force behind initiatives like the ABA Wellbeing Pledge and the Anti-Stigma campaign. His work has been featured in major outlets, including CNN, NPR, and the New York Times. Couldn't be more delighted to have you on the podcast, Patrick, and hear about all your great work. Welcome.
Craig, thank you. I appreciate the invitation to be here today, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, we've gotten to know each other recently, and I have really, really been impressed by how thoughtful you are. Talk a bit about, provide some context for folks about how you got into this world of supporting the legal profession in addiction and mental health issues.
Sure. So I am a lawyer. I'm licensed to practice law in California, and I was admitted to the bar about 23, 24 years ago at this point, but I don't practice law anymore, and I haven't for 15 years. After working in a couple of different roles, including as an associate in a large firm, I came to the realization that I was looking for something different. And when I look back on it with the benefit of some distance in hindsight, I think it really was a matter of the legal profession, and the job was not what I had anticipated. It didn't really resonate with me in a way that I had expected. Being, first generation lawyer, I had a lot of notions about what I was getting myself into. And anyhow, I was also someone who had my own personal struggles with alcohol, and I overcame those, continued to work as a lawyer, and then really sort of came to a realization that the profession was not going to lend itself to the type of fulfillment that I wanted. And it's not to say, not to bash the profession. It's not to really start off on a negative foot. It was personal to me. And so I made the decision to go back to school and pursue an alternative career path. And at that point, I was familiar with the role of addiction counselors, right? That was somebody that I had encountered in my own life. And so I saw that as a really meaningful opportunity to pivot. I became an addiction counselor, but I immediately focused my work on lawyers and judges and law students and the legal profession, which has no shortage of people who struggle with those issues. And so that's kind of a really quick overview of the trajectory. I, for a number of years, was the director of a treatment program for lawyers and judges and law students at Hazelden Betty Ford. They had a specialized treatment program for legal professionals. And I now, as you were noting in your introduction, I work as an advisor or consultant to primarily large law firms, but corporate legal departments and some mid-sized firms as well, basically trying to help them help their people. That's really the model of what we do.
Yeah. And in fact, to the contrary, that you were kind of rejecting the profession, your life work is really a love letter to the profession, an attempt to make the profession accessible to more people and make it a more fulfilling practice. So, it's amazing what you've done. And I think, we can all, any lawyer listening to this podcast can surmise what's challenging about being a lawyer. But talk about what is similar about the addiction found among lawyers, and what you're seeing that's a little different that you've spotted in your research over the years.
Well, it's interesting because for a lot of lawyers, they find themselves drawn into a hazardous, harmful, risky relationship with substances, not necessarily out of pleasure or thrill seeking. They're party animals who maybe just stayed at the party too long. It's often born out of self-medication, stress management, sort of a defective or maladaptive coping mechanism. That's not universally true, but it's true for many lawyers. And that was certainly true of many of the lawyers that I counseled in treatment. And so I think that's kind of an important difference right off the bat, right? There are what are known as drinking motives. And sometimes there are motives that are more social in nature. But then there are also motives that are what we would call coping motives for drinking, and that can lead to a higher level of risk. And I think that's an important distinction. But there are also a lot of norms within the profession that reinforce the behavior, right? So you've been part of the profession for a long time. I have. I'm not practicing law, but I still do very much consider myself part of the legal profession. And we just sort of look around. And the norms are, I think, well established and long standing that alcohol is pretty ingrained. And what that often leads to is people looking around, right? Maybe they're beginning to drink excessively or have their own unhelpful relationship to alcohol. And they look around and they kind of see a lot of the same. And that can then lead them to normalize or rationalize their own behaviors in a way that maybe wouldn't occur in other work contexts where there wasn't that very obvious and pervasive sort of social and cultural reinforcement. So I think those are some pretty important distinctions. And one final point, without going off on a total tangent about it, this one's huge. Lawyers feel, and often rightfully so, that they have a lot to lose by acknowledging that they might have a drinking problem or that they might have a drinking and drug problem. And so there is this very strong tendency to just kind of push it down, not acknowledge it, hide it, and not deal with it. And I think that often allows the problem to grow in people and to develop and become more entrenched than it might in someone else who felt more comfortable getting help sooner because they weren't as afraid of the professional repercussions.
And so by not being willing to talk about it with anybody else because of the stigma, basically they're pushing whatever it is down, and then it kind of spider webs throughout their entire life, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And we also, I think, in many ways, over-identify with our professional selves, right? Lawyers, it takes a lot to become a lawyer, right? You invest a lot of time, energy, money to really achieve that career milestone. And we tend to identify very strongly with that. And if you just kind of think about cognitive dissonance that someone might be experiencing, on the one hand, they know that I think I've got an addiction, or I think I have an alcohol problem or a drug problem, or sometimes it's mental health. It's not alcohol or drugs. And then on the other hand, they're thinking about their professional identity and all of the expectations and norms that go along with that and how much they value that. And it's really hard to come to terms with the fact that their personal struggles are in conflict with that professional identity. And again, just sort of leads to what can be a profound level of rationalization, private logic, denial.
And the alcohol or drugs essentially suppress the anxiety or the uncertainty that the person feels about their spot in the profession. Or talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it might temporarily, right? Yeah. So I think for most people who have any predisposition towards anxiety or depression, alcohol is only going to make it worse.
Yeah.
Right? Short term, it might feel like a short-term fix. It might feel efficacious for a period of time, but it is ultimately going to make the anxiety or the depression worse. And I think that they end up dealing sometimes with two problems rather than one. But that is the intention, right? Because it allows someone to maybe numb out or feel a little bit more in control, or to not be thinking about the stresses and the pressures, at least for that moment.
Yeah. Are there other types of escapes? I mean, you hear about this all the time, that, you know, somebody doesn't drink, but they escape in different ways. What are some things you saw that are forms of addiction that are essentially in the same family of, a temporary but bad fix to solve a problem, or you think it's solving a problem?
Well, I mean, you name it, right? There are a variety of ways in which people can seek relief from the stress and the pressure that they are experiencing. For some people, they might have more of a genetic predisposition towards true substance addiction, right? Alcohol or drug addiction. But for others, it's going to come out in behavioral or process addictions. There was, I think, just this month's ABA Journal has the cover story. It's about gambling addiction among lawyers and whether they are more prone to gambling addiction. And it talks about some of the personality traits of lawyers that might lend them to that. But it really could be anything from gambling to food to sex to shopping. I mean, really, if there is a way that people can seek relief that is not necessarily adaptive or healthy, there is someone out there doing that. And
Figured out. Yeah.
yeah, and important to note that these things often co-occur, right? And so it's not typical for someone to be dealing with just one problem. The problems might not be at the same level, but they could have other issues happening at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And are there, in your research, are there some pressure points that you're starting to see? Is it the billable hour? If you were to pick up some themes on, I know it's too easy to pick on one area, but what are some of the things that you're looking at that our profession has that's unique to being a lawyer?
Well, it's a big question, right? I think we might want to spend a minute on that because I think we're going to start with the acknowledgement that the profession, and this isn't something that was always top of mind for me, but it is now with my ongoing research, that the profession is not homogenous, right? And so the stressors, the pressure that somebody doing criminal law or, family law, public defender, something where they're dealing with a lot of personal traumas or tragedies or violence or abuse or neglect, it's going to be very different than the stress and the pressure that someone who's working on deals is facing. And it's not to rank them or say one is, more significant than the other. But I think the day-to-day experience of a lot of lawyers is different. However, if you wanted to kind of establish a through line, I think you could call it chronic stress, right? Regardless of the particular flavor, I think that chronic stress is a big challenge. You find that in other professions, other fields. Lawyers, I don't know, we have the market cornered, although there is some research indicating that lawyers experience the most stress. But when you have that stress in tandem or in combination with some other variables within the profession, I think it's going to lend itself to some unfavorable outcomes. We did ask in the study that I have, well, by the time this conversation is published, the study will have concluded. And we asked in there about whether, what do you think? We basically asked survey respondents, what do you think might be responsible for or driving some of the mental health and well-being challenges that legal professionals face? And they could sort of choose, I believe, up to 5 options. So I'm going to be very interested to see what lawyers themselves identify in a large national study or sort of crowdsourcing an answer there. Doesn't mean that it will be dispositive, but I do think it will be illuminating. Mm-hmm. So and from your perspective, you probably see a lot of different stresses and pressures bearing down on people. And to my point about it being different than what a prosecutor or someone doing criminal law might face, I think you probably agree with that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's so interesting because to me, there are different levels of stressors, right? I mean, it all comes down to the identification with, as you said before, being a lawyer and how important it is. And in some areas, how important it is to either have stature or to make money. I could speculate that the fact that lawyers sell their time, obviously means that the more it's kind of an insatiable opportunity that if you have the work, you're going to feel like it's a waste if you're not working. And so it makes it difficult to separate. I've been fortunate enough not to suffer from addiction, at least in a traditional sense, but I certainly have felt those pressures. And I think the American Lawyer publishing profits per partner and having us be somewhat ranked based on how much money we make obviously feeds into that. And then, in today's world, the ability to move around, but then have to prove yourself in a short period of time and make sure you bring your clients. As you know, I work in the lateral space as well. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on people to perform and justify the increase in money that they're getting to move laterally and things like that. So no, I find it fascinating. Are there recommendations you can talk about in this report that law firms like a K&L Gates can build into their scaffolding, if you will, to support lawyers and make sure that they minimize as much as they can the risk of addiction?
Well, I would say in terms of this study that's ongoing, it's too soon to know. So it was a large nationwide research project between it was Krill Strategies and the ABA collaborating on this project, which was intended to be a 10-year update on the 2016 ABA Hazel and Betty Ford study that I led when I was still at Hazel and Betty Ford. This study turned out to be huge. We had over 35,000 lawyers from around the country complete what was not a short survey. It took anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to complete. And so we are enormously grateful to the lawyers who were randomly selected from all regions of the country. To have that size of a data set, I think is really important. And I think it's going to allow us to draw some really useful insights. What those will be as it relates specifically to what employers can do, I don't know, right? We're going to spend the fall analyzing the data, and then we plan to publish the report early next year. But given that size, it's going to have a lot of statistical power. It was a random sample, and I think we will be able to generate some really useful insights and recommendations for the profession. What I would say generally, and we can broaden this out from addiction, right? So my work encompasses mental health, well-being, and really kind of all things that would come under that umbrella of behavioral health. I would say for any law firm that wants to make improvements and to experience progress related to supporting the health and well-being of their people, you've got to sort of move from what I've labeled or described as the resource provision phase of this well-being movement or well-being effort to the risk factor mitigation phase, right? So over the last 7-8 years, a lot of law firms, they signed the ABA Wellbeing Pledge. They've taken a lot of affirmative steps to build a scaffolding, to offer resources and provide better support to people, whether that's counseling, benefits, an EAP, apps, webinars, right? All of those things. And all of those things were needed, and they didn't really exist at the level that was, I think, appropriate. So we've made significant progress there. However, that's only going to get us so far, right? And so it's going beyond that resource provision phase, which I think a lot of firms have done a good job of, and starting to say, okay, well, let's go upstream a little bit, right? And it's kind of getting at sort of what we've been talking about. What are some of those risk factors? What are some of those things that we can seek to mitigate, right? And so I think that the first step is for a firm to say, okay, I understand that concept, right? Moving beyond the provision of resources alone. Now, how do we look at some of the drivers, and what are some of the things that we can maybe take a look at, make some modifications, without reinventing the business model or blowing it up? Because while you could say, and I think rightfully so, that there are many aspects of the law firm business model that contribute to the stress and the pressure, if you come in with a proposal to just ditch that and reinvent yourself, that's totally impractical, and it's not going to be met with any level of receptivity, right? And so I think you want to start a little smaller, but intentionally in making some efforts to address some of those risk factors. One thing that I'm really worried about, and this is not just in the legal profession, but in society, is loneliness. And I think with the growing embeddedness of technology in our lives, in our, growing interaction with AI as opposed to people, and loneliness is a huge problem.
Yeah.
And I think it can really exacerbate or cause a lot of mental health and substance use problems. And we got to be more aware of that. We did measure it in the study. I don't know what the results are going to say yet, but we did assess loneliness among lawyers. And I would say that firms should keep an eye on that.
Yeah. I mean, and what's interesting is you did an exhaustive study in 2016, pre-COVID and pre the use of video communication and remote work as a thing. that seem to occur with COVID, and you're now doing it post-COVID. I'll be fascinated to see your observations on loneliness because, and we'll get into mentorship in a minute, but I mean, we have made it more challenging to detect addiction, I would imagine. Is that some of what you're starting to see?
I think so. I think we have made it more challenging to detect addiction, depression, anxiety, burnout. There was an acute problem during COVID, and really when everybody was working from home for a period of time, described as covert impairment, right? People were unwell and often very unwell, but it was just flying under the radar, right? Because they were still able to communicate electronically over email, whatever. And so that is not as acute as it was, but it's still a big problem. And, that level of disconnection, I think it's also what it's done is remove some of the buffers against the stress and pressure we feel, because human connection and a sense of connection and belonging and camaraderie and friendship, right? Feeling like our social needs are being at least mostly met, that buffers against the stress and it helps buffer against the burnout. And when you take that out of the equation, you're just left with more risk factor and less protective factor.
Yeah, so interesting. And talk a bit about, let me frame it this way. You made a comment to me when we were talking about the burnout of addiction treatment counselors, I believe, and which to me is an interesting phenomenon, right? Well, you describe it. Like, what's going on there? Why is somebody whose profession it is to help folks through addiction, why do they burn out?
Well, I think it's often due to the enormous emotional toll that work can take. And it's probably not dissimilar from people working in other therapeutic settings, dealing with people in crisis, right? And now I was referencing specifically people working in, addiction treatment. Somebody may be working as an outpatient counselor to people with a much more limited caseload that they can control, might be different. But as a profession overall, the longevity has always been a problem. And it is often because you're dealing with people and you're trying to help people who are in a state of crisis often. And it's hard to maintain effective boundaries with that and to not have that start to, there's a phenomenon known as compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, related concepts. But, people can begin to absorb a lot of that pain and a lot of that crisis that people are experiencing. And so, it's different, but there's probably some lesson there for the legal profession too, which is simply being better prepared for some of the experiences and stressors that you might encounter, right? And depending on the nature of your practice, you might get clients dealing with a variety of problems. And when you're doing that long enough and often enough and under enough pressure, starts to feel like your problems, and you really can begin to absorb all of that and experience some of that vicarious trauma as well. And so I think to the extent that we could give more lawyers education, training, and tools to help them manage those emotions and maintain those boundaries, I think it would be time well spent.
Yeah. And the flip of it is, talk a bit about what training somebody like me, who maybe hasn't suffered from addiction, but cares deeply about the lawyers with whom I work. What can I be trained on? What can general, all of us be trained on to help avoid stimulating addiction risk and then supporting or identifying someone with addiction?
So generally speaking, out there in kind of the corporate space, the professional services space, certainly the law firm space, there's a growing emphasis on management and leadership training, kind of mental health awareness more broadly. Certainly involves substance use and addiction risk, but basically just making sure that people have a baseline understanding of what we're talking about when we say mental health. What are we talking about when we say addiction? What's normal in terms of someone's relationship to substances, what's not, and not assuming that everyone gets it, because not everyone gets it. And some people have views that are informed by their own biases, their own worldview, not necessarily informed by the latest thinking or accurate science on any of these conditions. So just having some baseline awareness and understanding, I think, is essential for anyone who is leading other people, right? It's especially true with the generational differences that we're seeing with younger people reporting and experiencing higher levels of depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges. So leaders have got to have that awareness. I think it's also important to just be mindful of the role. What are you role modeling, right? What are your behaviors? And are you signaling to people that, a lot of maladaptive coping mechanisms in service of delivering the goods is the key to success? I mean, maybe it's been the key to someone's success, right? Because it has for some people, they're able to, but that doesn't mean that should be what you're role modeling to your, those lawyers that you're mentoring or leading or supervising, right? And I think that can be part of a mental health awareness training course or a separate course. But, what are we role modeling? What behaviors are we lionizing? What kind of language are we using? What are we rewarding? What are we incentivizing? And you think about a busy lawyer who's got a busy practice, a lot of demands on their time. They probably aren't allowing for a lot of bandwidth to reflect on those things, right? Because that's not the job. And it's not, at least historically, how we've conceived of the job.
Yeah, we have a great chief people officer, we call it Amy Horn, who I've connected you with. And, one of the wonderful points of emphasis in some of her programming has been around, if you're taking a vacation, don't pretend like you're not taking a vacation, because not only are you not getting a vacation, but you're basically stigmatizing being away for vacation. There are lots of interesting pressures, and it does feel like, Patrick, that it's a bit nuanced. Like everybody has their own triggers, and as an addiction counselor, I'm sure you've seen all that at a very granular level. But talk about the gender differences, and what is the profession getting a bit more right in terms of child rearing, or the pressures of balancing parenthood and profession? And what does the profession, in your opinion, still have a little work to do? Where does it have a little work to do?
I think generally speaking, and I'm sure there are some firms who are doing better and some employers who are doing better in this realm than others. But generally speaking, I don't think the profession is nearly as conducive to people kind of having bandwidth for their family obligations as it should be. My research study that I published in 2020, we surveyed lawyers in California and DC, and we saw high levels of work-family conflict that really did predict whether someone was likely to have depression, anxiety, say they were thinking about leaving due to burnout, whether they were more likely to have a drinking problem, et cetera. Work-family conflict is often a big driver of some of the stress and pressure people feel, and it's hard to reconcile the two things. I mean, I'm sure you've heard stories, horror stories, they occasionally still pop up online in articles today about, women saying the sacrifices that they were asked to make and basically told, you can't have children if you want to make partner and that type of thing. I don't know where the profession stands on that specific experience today, except for what I hear from other lawyers, which is that we've got a long way to go.
Yeah.
And I would like to see us make more progress in that regard, because I think it lends itself to a more, someone with a more balanced life who ultimately is probably going to have a more durable career.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And the having different paths to success that I've heard you talk about in some of your previous podcasts and your writings, whether they be balanced hours or, requiring men to take time off post the birth of a child, so that the women and men aren't on different starting points. I'm married to a lawyer. We've been, happily married. What do you say? You've been married for 33 years or whatever. We've actually been married, 33 years, and we've been happily married for 30 or whatever the joke is. But I do remember we have 3 kids, and I remember thinking, my wife was a better law student than I would. Like, she's a fantastic lawyer. And I just remember thinking, how is she able to separate her ego from being a lawyer and then just focusing on being the best mom she could be? Like, I can't even relate to that. And then I realized after a while, painfully, that's hard for anybody, man, woman, or otherwise, to kind of say, okay, my career is on hold, this career I've really worked for, and I'm going to have to start over in a sense if I take a year or 2 years off to really focus on being a parent. So yeah, I applaud you for the gender nuancing in your work, because I do think everybody's a bit different and everybody's going to have different stressors, and those observations will be really interesting to read when you guys are done with the study. What do you recommend if there was a book or two that you would recommend for a mentor to read to just be attuned to the risks? Is there something you recommend for, or maybe a spouse of somebody with an addiction issue or addiction risk?
Not necessarily. It's a good question. Not necessarily one book. There is an organization that I would point people to, led by, again, a guy named John Kelly. He's a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. But at Mass General, there is this institute called the Recovery Research Institute, and they have a wealth of information available on their website. Articles, studies, really, there's just a lot there, and it takes a lot of time to get through it all. So it's Recovery Research Institute. You'll find it as soon as you Google that term. But the work of John Kelly generally, he's done a lot to inform the conversation around recovery, around addiction, around, recovery and addiction and the relationship to mental health. And so I would use that as a jumping off point for someone who is looking for resources, looking for guidance, and kind of just wanting to find more information related to these topics. When it comes to books about whether it's mental health or addiction or anything, where I am these days on that is I'm reading less that is directly and facially about mental health, right? So I'm not picking up the latest book on the latest cognitive, behavioral technique or theory or anything like that. It's really looking for strands of that human experience in other areas and disciplines in literature and poetry, and just kind of connecting to the human undercurrent of all of this. Because I think sometimes we can get too caught up in the academic realm and the latest, phraseology or buzzword or construct that is really catching people's attention, and losing sight of the human aspect of all of this, right? We're talking about the human condition and the way that it manifests sometimes. And I hope that point makes sense, but that's just where I've been learning a lot lately is kind of finding that. And you could, go back to the Stoics, right? I mean, and various different traditions, religious, spiritual traditions throughout the history of literature. There's so much that might not be saying this is about depression, or this is how you manage anxiety. But there are nonetheless so many lessons and so many timeless lessons that can be found by understanding the experience and perspectives of other humans that have dealt with the issues.
Yeah, it's so, yes. I recently, I got a call from a buddy, and he was just so upset about the state of our world, whatever it was, right? That he was, and he just said, what would you do? And I said, well, what helps me when I'm upset with things is to create some distance between that emotion, that feeling, and my reaction to that emotion or feeling. And the best way for me is exactly what you described, Patrick, is studying the Stoics. I love Ryan Holiday because he kind of digests the Stoics, right, for all of us to Eckhart Tolle. When I had a life crisis 10 plus years ago, I absolutely related to his concept of separating the recognizing what the ego meant and what I identified with that was probably unhealthy for me. And we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, identifying with being a lawyer that makes a lot of money with the fancy car, with the right lifestyle, with, being an equity partner, an income partner, or picket. I love that. Is there one, there's so many great ones, but is there one that, you would say this one hit me?
I'd have a hard time narrowing it down to one.
I bet.
They're really just, I think there are so many. Eckhart Tolle, I think his work is really, really, I think in many ways profound and has influenced a lot of my thinking as well. His concept that addiction begins in pain and ends in pain, I think is so concise and so accurate. And I don't know that anyone else has particularly formulated it exactly like that, but it's true. Addiction starts in pain and ends in pain. Gabor Mate, I don't know if you're familiar with him and work around trauma and mental health. I think he has a lot of really, really fascinating insights. It's summer. I've been reading a lot of things that are a little bit lighter, but for anyone who's ever felt that they struggle with inadequacy or imposter syndrome or neuroses, pick up something by David Sedaris, right? It's just like an exploration of those conditions, and often told in a way that I think is just so human and so relatable and enjoyable.
He's my wife's absolute favorite writer.
Okay. There you go.
Anytime he comes to Dallas once a year, and it doesn't matter where we are, we have to make sure we're in Dallas to go to that because he is so funny. I mean, in person, to listen to him and riff on his stories. We were about to go on to Africa with the family, and he did his thing on, going on safari, which is very, very, very funny. I agree. And look, I like history, and for me, history can provide some space too, to recognize that these aren't new issues that we're dealing with, maybe variations of a theme, but everybody's had to struggle through them. Biographies, you read about a person like a Winston Churchill, and you realize, they put their pants on, one leg at a time as well. So,
and I think takes us back to a point I was making earlier about loneliness, right? And I think people increasingly feel isolated, disconnected from others. But when you can read the story of someone else, right, whether it's history, whether it's literature, and kind of understand that these are human conditions and other people have experienced them, I think that can sometimes help mitigate our sense of total isolation from others. And that's just different than reading something that's more kind of academic or clinical in nature that isn't necessarily going to connect you to that shared human experience.
Yeah. Well said. And so if I'm sure many people listening will be people who have maybe not necessarily been addicts, but have supported somebody going through treatment or staying sober. What do you see that causes a breakdown in somebody's sobriety? And are there things that you would say, those of us who support folks trying to stay sober, what we can do to be helpful?
Well, I think generally speaking, it depends on where the person is in that journey, right? So someone who's been sober for a year, I think, is going to have different risk factors and vulnerabilities than someone who's been sober for 5 or 20 years, right? There's actually a lot of interesting research on that the trajectory and the further you get into recovery, as you might imagine, generally the more durable it is and the lower the risk of relapse. But I think just having open lines of communication with people so that they can talk about how they're doing, so that they don't feel like they need to, whatever burdens they're carrying in their life or in your relationship or whatever it might be, that they don't feel like they need to carry that alone and start keeping secrets. Because generally speaking, honesty, open communication, human connection, these are ways to keep people well and to help them stay on track. It's you're obviously familiar with the concept of AA, the program of AA and NA. Yeah. And it's really that human connection aspect of that is often viewed as sort of AA's secret sauce, right? It's that allowing people to maintain a sense of connection to others that they can talk to, relate to. So if you start to see someone pulling back, isolating, withdrawing, they seem like they're, kind of dealing with things on their own or not opening up or, hiding things, I think that would be a sign that you want to really engage with the person and make sure that they're doing okay. I guess would be my general advice.
Yeah, because there's so much shame wrapped up in not just the addiction, but the primary sources of the addiction, because you're feeling like you're failing. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, there can be. I think for some people there can be this sense that how could I possibly be returning to that after everything that I've done and gone through. But I'll say this. Often people might have what would be considered a relapse or a slip, and it is due to what's happening in their life at that moment, but they're able to course correct pretty quickly.
Yeah.
They're typically more able to course correct quickly when they have a support network, when they have people looking out for them, and when they're not living a life, in isolation without that support and connection. But, the flip side of it is that, and I think this is a really important point because statistically speaking, people listening to this conversation, some of them are going to have a hazardous relationship with substances of some nature, right? There might be people out there thinking, what do I have to gain? Is that really an achievable goal for me to quit drinking or quit using drugs? And I think the flip side, not thinking so much about relapse, it's important to think about and focus more on the benefits of recovery and everything that unlocks for people. And most lawyers that I know who are in long-term recovery, and many of them are open about it at this point because it's a source of pride and they feel confident and stable in it, they're going to tell you that they're a better lawyer, they're a better partner, spouse, parent, friend, community member, whatever it is, as a result of being able to get sober or stop using the substance, but B, everything that went along with that process, right? Just becoming more authentic, becoming more honest, developing coping mechanisms that are adaptive and healthy, and just taking better care of themselves.
Yeah. I mean, you hit it to me, which is authenticity. Your observations are so much more profound because they have so much data behind them and you've experienced addiction. But I feel like it's almost like once you stop pretending to be something you're not, and you're very comfortable with who you are and you submit, which is a big part of AA, right? It doesn't designate a religion. In fact, right, you're prohibited in AA from talking about a specific kind of religion, but you are submitting to something that is outside of your control.
Yes.
And that's
something bigger than yourself.
Yeah. Something bigger than yourself. Exactly. So it just feels like that helps you align with not caring as much about every little thing that drives so much of our anxiety,
Yeah. Can't. Life's too short.
Life's
right. And, that actually brings me back, that word authenticity brings me back to another question you asked earlier about what can law firms be doing maybe to mitigate some of the stressors and risk factors. If you look broadly at society, trends in social media, just kind of trends generally, there is what at least appears to be a higher level of people are seeking authenticity, right? That's what they want in the media they consume and their relationships with others, et cetera. In the legal profession, lawyers, you think about the tension that exists between authenticity and the expectations that go along with your job and with your role, right? That leads to a phenomenon known as emotional dissonance, or sometimes described as emotional labor, where the way you feel inside is not how you are presenting outside, often due to professional norms and expectations, right? And so I think there are probably few work settings where that is as significant of a factor as law, where we have very specific norms and expectations, right? You behave like a lawyer, you think like a lawyer, you act like a lawyer, and everything that goes along with that. But guess what? That might not be how people are feeling inside, right? They could have a lot of anxiety or fear or whatever it might be. And so if there are ways that you can allow for a little more authenticity in your culture while also preserving those norms and expectations, because we are professionals and we are licensed and we do have certain ways that we need to comport ourselves, but still allowing for a little more authenticity. I think that's going to go a long way towards creating an environment where people feel healthier, where people feel more supported, and where they feel more connected, because that emotional dissonance can really take a toll on people, that emotional labor, and it can increase anxiety, depression, stress. It can increase intentions to leave your organization because, just that tension you feel on a regular basis is it's uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, and you and I have been at this in different ways for a while, but we've observed the human condition. And one thing I have observed that is absolutely validates your point, not that it needs validating, is that from the perspective of a mentor or somebody who is in a position of power over you, actually just saying it, I'm having a hard time, or I screwed something up. That's always a lot better than hiding it and doing the next thing that isn't aligned with the mistake you made. It's always the second mistake that really makes people wonder if they can trust you anymore or whatever. I remember being petrified as a young lawyer. I'd brought in a few of my own clients as an associate back when the Earth's crust was still cooling. And I went into managing partner and I had to do a write-off, and I mean, I'm sure it was like $6,000 or something, but it was a write-off. And I was just like, very nervous about it. And he looked at me and he said, Budner, if you don't occasionally write off some time for clients, you're never going to have any clients. Like, it just means you're not succeeding. And there's this, we have on our client growth team, our business development team, a set of values. And one of them is fail well. The Google concept that if you're not failing, if you're not experiencing some hardship, you're probably not doing what you need to be doing, and then just embrace that. So I love your point on, long-winded way of saying, I love your point on, don't take everything so deadly serious. We're not that important,
Yes. Yeah. Just look for more ways to be real. And that point about the write-off, I think it's a really tangible example that a lot of people could probably relate to.
Yeah. Yeah. And in organizations, make sure, your young developing lawyers understand it's okay to screw up. It's okay to, to need a couple of days to sort through something that you're having a hard time with. Like, we need to talk.
Well, I mean, I think for myself, for many people, this is probably true for you in some contexts. Aspects of our success they're a result of our prior failures, right? Mistakes we make, and then we learn from them, and then we do something differently and better, right? And that can be on a large scale, it can be on a small scale, but making mistakes and getting things wrong is part of growth. And it's really how you adapt to that, I think, that makes the difference.
Amen. Last topic, the studies in the process of coming out, the results of it. Tell us what to expect and how should we read it? What comes after the study? Give me an update on that.
Yeah, great question. So as I was saying, the first point is that this study is quite large in terms of the data set, in terms of the number of respondents. It'll be over 35,000. We haven't sorted through the data to take out the incomplete surveys, but that's huge for this type of research. But it was also a random sample, which adds more weight and validity to the findings and their generalizability to the broader legal profession. So I do think that there's going to be, some reliability of these findings and painting the picture of what lawyers are dealing with. All research is subject to limitations and caveats, right? Of course, that. I think everyone reasonable knows that. I do think one area that I'm really interested to focus on is the reported prevalence of burnout. We hear a lot about lawyer burnout, but it's never been measured nationally using a validated assessment.
Yeah.
We use something called the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory. So it's a validated tool that actually captures burnout. And so it'll be really interesting to see what the prevalence of that is, how that varies by practice setting, by age groups, and all those different demographics, I think are going to be really important to look at. Also looking at the relationship between burnout and loneliness and other mental health challenges. I'm really curious to see, as I was saying earlier, what lawyers think the primary drivers and stressors are, because the survey did ask about a lot of things. I mean, we asked also about the role of AI and whether people think it's going to increase or decrease their own personal well-being. We asked people whether they think it's important for the profession to maintain or increase a focus on mental health, so I think all of those things are going to give us so much to look at. We won't be able to capture it all in one paper. It's just impossible, right? Because journals have scopes. And so the first paper, which I expect to be published early next year, right, in a peer-reviewed journal, is going to be kind of the headline prevalence of, the prevalence estimates of the various conditions we were looking at, and some of the, sort of bigger picture takeaways there. That will be followed by probably a couple more papers that dive into some of those more nuanced relationships and the interplay between the variables. All told, there's so much data here that I think we're going to be able to generate a lot of really instructive information, reports for the profession. I expect, because this is done in collaboration with the American Bar Association and their Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs, I expect them to do a lot with the findings and to, generate reports and maybe re-energize task forces or other efforts that have been underway around the country to address this issue. But, I think it's going to give us sort of fresh eyes on the challenges, but also, and this is really important, I want to underscore this point. I wasn't wanting to, and I'm not really interested in admiring the problem. This is not just how bad are things. It really is also intended, even more so, to help us understand possible pathways to improvement and solution. I think we know that there are challenges in the legal profession related to mental health. It's important to have an updated picture of that for sure. But then, my hope, my goal is that the data will really show us the path forward in some various ways.
Well, you are the path forward because you make all of us aware, whether we're suffering with stresses in our life, you're helping us make ourselves aware of those stresses or how to be useful to people who are suffering stress. And all of us fit into those categories at various points in time. So, as a firm with substantial Pittsburgh roots, Canal Gates, we're very proud, and those who will get to know you through this are going to be very proud of the fact that you're a Pittsburgh, a Yinzer, is that what we call it?
I am a Yinzer.
Yeah. And much appreciation to Margaret Smith for making the introduction. I had Neil on the podcast a few episodes ago, and he talked very movingly about the loss of his son to suicide and how he handles that. And I just think that your why, Patrick, is so profoundly important to our profession, to keep our profession vibrant and in keeping with how important it is, because the rule of law, as we know, is so important to everything and what makes our world operate at an effective level, at least in my opinion. So thank you. Thank you for agreeing to be on this podcast, but more importantly, thank you for your life's work, because I really think it is helping all of us be more evolved professionals.
Well, it's kind of you to say, Craig. Thank you. I was glad to be here. It was enjoyable to talk with you today. So thanks for the opportunity. And, I look forward to many more great discussions.
Same.